Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 6, Temples and Tombs of a Long Civilization's Trail, an account of recent experiences in mystic places and strange lands, by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. An article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 15, Number 6, July 1937. A Long Civilization's Trail by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. Editor's note: this is the 6th episode of a narrative by the Supreme Secretary relating the experiences he and his party had in visiting mystic shrines and places in Europe and the ancient world. Temples and tombs. I had, in my semi-conscious state of half-sleep, a sensation of choking. It was undoubtedly this laborious breathing with the addition of stifling heat that awakened me at an early hour. I lay still for a moment, trying to swallow. My mouth was parched, and a deep inhalation made me sneeze. The compartment was filled with a fine dust. I could feel it in my ears and on my hands. Kicking off the remaining cover, I sat up and, leaning forward, raised the blind at the window. The sight that greeted my eyes made me forget the discomfort of an Egyptian train in the late summer. Paralleling the track, 100 yards distant, was a twisting brown ribbon of water. Bowing gracefully on either side of it were palms, bending far over the embankment as if admiring their beauty in the water below. Beyond, the sand stretched into the distance and finally disappeared at the horizon into the rosy radiance of the morning sun. It was a scene that would tax your credence if it were upon canvas. Egypt was beautiful in a wild sort of way. Its beauty lay in its extremes. There was no attempt at compromise. Each element gave vent to its powers, and the aggregate was the majestic splendor of uncontrolled nature. As we rushed and swayed along, eddies of air sprayed the window pane with sand, which clung for a few seconds and then dropped away, revealing new charming vistas. Beautiful islets dotted the center of the Nile, crowded to the water's edge with tall palm trees. Water buffalo looked lazily up at us as the river lapped at the ridges of their backs, and little naked, brown-skinned boys pulled at ropes fastened to the animals' nostrils. Little girls stopped in their tracks and, turning, unconsciously posed with earthen water jars on their heads to stare with mingled expressions of curiosity and perplexity at this modern invader of the land of their ancestors, ancestors of which we, from another land, knew more than they. On either side of this road of steel upon which we traveled, the scene was little changed from the time the pharaohs had thundered over the same sands in chariots or haughtily surveyed them from royal barges which were leisurely propelled along the Nile. What little inroad the centuries had made, the progress of 5,000 years, was symbolized and embodied in this metallic speeding serpent. This Cairo to Aswan Express, like a single thread of different color in a great fabric, it was noticeable. But other than that, there was little effect upon the surroundings. The deluxe trains of Egypt are as yet untouched by such improvements or embellishments as air conditioning, ice water, or club cars. You either remain confined to your own red plush, heavily laced and French-mirrored compartment, or stand swaying in the narrow aisle outside. It was with welcome relief that we arrived at Luxor. The platform of the Luxor depot paralleled the train for only the length of one car. If you were fortunate, you stepped from this one car onto brick surface, otherwise into the soft, powdered dust of the ground. Each step, no matter how easily taken, sent a puff of the flour-like substance over shoes and trouser legs. We had become accustomed to being besieged by dragoman guides and natives in soiled, long, flowing robes with bare feet and shaved heads, who wished to carry luggage or perform some actual or imaginary service for bakshish, money. At first, the pitiful state of their appearance, which was often heightened by their dramatic gestures and poses, had invoked our sympathy, and as an act of charity we would engage a retinue of boys from 6 to 60 to do trivial or unnecessary things for us. Time and the experience of having our generosity taken advantage of had hardened us, and we coursed through the group around us, saying, Imshi, begone. We were escorted to a row of 4 or 5 waiting, dilapidated, single-horse and team-drawn surreys. It was not the state of the conveyances that attracted our attention, but the wretched condition of the animals themselves. They were a greater evidence of the poverty and deplorable state of welfare of the Egyptian fellah than his own personal appearance. The horses were not all aged, but were mere frames, covered with tightly drawn flesh. The whole skeletal structure was, it seemed to us, visible. Most of the unfortunate beasts suffered from mange, and large areas of their bodies contained cankerous sores over which the large, leech-like flies of Upper Egypt hovered. The spirit of dejection of the animals was contagious, and it was several minutes before we felt inclined to comment on our surroundings. After riding for a few minutes, we stopped before a high stucco wall in which there was a large arched portal. We literally had to push our way through a throng of mendicants and peddlers of scarabs, necklaces, beads, counterfeit amulets, and relics. Once having passed through the gateway, we were free, for apparently a well-established law or custom exacting some severe penalty of which we were not aware, forbade them to enter. We were in a charming garden and grove. Tall, stately palms grouped closely cast a pleasing shade. Strange foliage offered relief from the glaring white of the sandy road outside. We recalled the story of the Garden of Allah, the site of which existed but a scant mile from where we were. The ground was moist, having been watered recently. The hotel hallways were like those one imagined the hostelries of the tropics would have. Irregular tiled floors and glazed tile walls, with exceptionally high white plastered ceilings. The crepuscular lighting made them invitingly cool. Behind us, a native attendant glided silently. The manner in which he appeared suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere and almost anticipating our needs in advance, was uncanny. In contrast to the natives of the village and those who waited outside the courtyard below, these attendants were immaculately groomed and spoke excellent English. Their pay, though a paltry sum, exceeded by far that of their less fortunate brothers, and they were envied. The heavy white fly netting which was suspended over the beds and the large balcony in each room, from which one could look over the gardens below, gave ample suggestion of insects and heat to be endured here at this season, both day and night. Our first duty was to obtain the necessary permits to take professional cinema photographs of the monuments. The monuments is the official term given to all ancient ruins now supervised by the Department of Antiquities in Egypt. The one who held supreme authority here was the Inspector of Antiquities of Upper Egypt, Labib Habachi. After a brief respite, we drove to his office, a low, one-story grey stone and stucco building exceedingly quaint, surrounded by a spacious garden in which stood statuary, busts of Egyptian figures of different dynasties. They, of course, immediately aroused our interest. This personal office consisted of a random-sized plank floor, high ceiling and French windows. At the opposite end from which we entered, seated behind a well-worn, flat-topped desk and framed by bookcases, facing us, sat Inspector Labib Habachi. He was a surprisingly young man. In his late 20s, medium height, close-cropped black curly hair, deep set. Dreamy eyes and the heavy dark-rimmed glasses he wore gave him the look of a scholar, which we found him to be. He was so different from the others we had met that, in our minds, we likened him to the ancient Egyptian nobility or the scribes of the past. Lying open before him were textbooks on Egyptian hieroglyphs and archaeology, and apparently he had been identifying inscriptions on small bronze statuettes which stood before him on the desk when we entered. He was exceedingly gracious and spoke in the soft, mild voice of the cultured Egyptian. He was a graduate of the University of Cairo, spoke several languages fluently, and was specializing in the study of archaeology, which made it possible for him to hold his present responsible position. It was, however, more than a professional interest, this one could easily ascertain from his conversation, for he had a deep reverence for the achievements of his ancient progenitors. When he learned that we too had a love for the accomplishments of past great Egyptian personalities, and were not there to exploit his country, but to make her former glories known throughout North America by means of motion pictures we hoped to take, he was exceedingly congenial. He spent nearly an hour in comparing for us certain hieroglyphics with the later hieratic or demotic writing. In addition to his studies, he had fortunately the hobby of photography, but he was just a beginner, and the science of photography was still quite a mystery to him. Our complex equipment interested him immensely. He had apparently never before had the opportunity to examine sound cinema apparatus. This interest made him, after a careful examination of our credentials, enthusiastic in his desire to obtain from his superiors in Cairo the permits which we needed. After the custom of an Egyptian host, he had us served with cold lemonade by one of his slippered attendants. When we left, he bade us return early in the morning to learn whether he had received a telegraphic order to issue the coveted permit. The following morning, we were presumptuous enough to have our guide instruct the native porters to load our cinema equipment in the old model American automobile, which was to serve as our conveyance to the inspector's house. We hoped the permission had arrived, and if so, we were prepared to proceed immediately. The morning light was best for photography, affording more contrast than the glaring midday sunlight. Inspector Hibachi met us in the courtyard and, smiling, said in a quiet manner, "Your wish has been granted. The Minister of Antiquities, my superior in Cairo, has granted you permission to photograph all the monuments with your cinema equipment. I have here the official permit." We gratefully accepted it, and our spirits were jubilant. Turning to Freighter Brower, Inspector Hibachi said, "I ask of you one personal favor. May I accompany you on your expedition? I feel I could profit by watching you operate your equipment, and in turn, I may be useful in explaining more thoroughly the monuments to you and reading different inscriptions which have not been generally translated." We were elated and gladly accepted this most satisfactory arrangement. The present city of Luxor is located on the east side of the Nile. Eastward, looking toward the horizon, one sees the distant Arabian desert, and beyond lies the Red Sea. Westward, one looks toward a range of limestone mountains, the mysterious and famed Valley of the Kings. Where are now located the city of Luxor and the temples of Luxor and Karnak, there was once the major portion of the great city of Thebes, the former capital of the great empire. The city of Thebes also spread over to the west bank of the Nile. Our first site to be photographed was the mammoth Karnak temple, which beggars description. The actual significance of the word Karnak is not definitely known. It is said the literal translation means windows. This splendid edifice was built from the wealth accumulated from the early Egyptian campaigns in Asia. The entire length of the temple, or shall we say series of temples, is 1/4 of a mile, and it took some 2,000 years to complete construction. The oldest portions of it were begun by the early kings of the feudal age of Egypt. Later portions were completed by the Greek kings, or the Ptolemies. The first Ptolemy was a former general in the army of Alexander the Great. Originally, the entire structures were done in magnificent colors and gold. They were the most beautiful and decorative of all the architectural works of ancient man. In the center of one of the temples stands the enormous obelisk of Egypt's most famous queen, Hatshepsut. Its size can better be realized by the fact that its base is 8.5 feet thick. The most impressive edifice of this collection of edifices is the great colonnaded hall, or hypostyle. This hall is 338 feet wide and 170 feet deep. Each one of the enormous columns rises to a height of 69 feet, and the capitals of the columns, which are ornamented after the shape of the lotus flower, are sufficiently large to accommodate on their tops 100 men standing in close formation. The entire floor area of this colonnaded hall is equal to that of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. The center aisle, or nave, consists of 12 columns in 2 rows, 79 feet in height. They rise slightly higher than the rows of columns of the aisles on either side, and thus really form the first clerestory, which was finally incorporated as part of the later Greek basilica, and which style comes down to us in our Gothic church architecture of today. This clerestory, by rising higher than the halls on either side of it, permits light to enter through the elevated sides and thus enter the lower halls. The walls around this colonnaded hall are deeply etched with inscriptions and reliefs dealing with the early campaigns and wars of the past kings and pharaohs. Here, cut out of mammoth stone blocks weighing from 80 to 1,000 tons, are colossal portraits of these rulers of a past civilization. It would be a considerable engineering task today to quarry in one piece such enormous blocks and to move them from the quarry intact to the place of their erection. One is forced again to admire the skill and ability of these ancient builders. As we stood at one end of the nave of this great temple and looked upward, we saw, high above our heads, at the opposite end, a stone lattice window, the only remaining one of several windows which originally surrounded that portion of the nave which rose above the halls on either side of it. And it is believed that from these windows or grills the temple gained its name of Karnak. We profited greatly by the detailed descriptions and explanations of our eminent companion, Inspector Hibachi, and were able to make many notes to incorporate in the dialogue of the motion picture, which at this time is being edited for exposition purposes. Furthermore, we were permitted to set up our equipment in and enter places, inner sanctuaries of this Karnak temple, usually forbidden the average visitor or traveler. With the passing of each hour, the heat increased. The temperature rose to nearly 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and our native porters, whom we'd engaged to carry our equipment luggage, were reluctant to continue, as it is their custom to take a siesta from noon until 4 in the afternoon. Our time was limited. We were allowed just 1 week, and so we had to disappoint them and oblige them to continue. We entered the beautiful little temple of Thutmose III, who was related to the early foundation of the Rosicrucian order. See picture in November 1937, issue of the Rosicrucian Digest. There, outside of the portal in pure white, in contrast to the grey stone columns and pylons about it, was the little altar of this early mystery school. It seemed like a dream, so quiet, so peaceful, so sturdy, and yet representing a people and a time of thousands of years ago. It did not seem possible that something constructed so long ago could be in such a perfect state of preservation. In this ideal climate of Egypt, where rain falls every 30 or 40 years, which makes of the land a warehouse kept at a constant temperature, free of moisture, all antiquities will remain in an excellent state of preservation, perhaps for centuries to come. Approximately 1,000 feet of film were ground out within this edifice alone. We reluctantly returned to our hotel, but were assured that we would find additional splendor in Luxor Temple on the morrow. The next morning at the same hour, we were once again accompanied by Inspector Hibachi and went immediately to Luxor Temple, also known as El Aksur, or the Castles. The length of Luxor Temple from front to back is 300 yards and was mainly built under the direction of that famous builder, Amenhotep III. During the campaigns of Alexander the Great, it was partially destroyed, and temples of the Greeks were set up within its midst. At a still later period, the Christians entered this magnificent structure and defaced portions of its beauty by chiseling hieroglyphics and inscriptions from its walls and covering them with crude, coarse plaster on which they painted even more crude murals depicting incidents of the Christian Bible. To us, this seemed a sacrilege, not because Christianity established itself in Egypt and attempted to further its ends, but because there was more to these temples than the worshippers' religion, their beliefs in the hereafter, or their interpretations of a god. There was their physical beauty, their architecture, their art. These things belong to all religions and not to any sect. And it is the duty of religion to preserve beauty, because as Plato has taught us, through beauty of the external world, man can come to have greater appreciation of the better life. Those things which represent the beauty of his inner nature or his soul. And we felt that this desecration on the part of the early Christians was not to their credit. Our companion also showed us other chisel marks on the side of a great stone wall. These marks were made during the time of our venerated Rosicrucian Grand Master, Amenhotep IV. Centuries before Christianity, as we know, he had the first monotheistic conception, the belief in a single or sole God. He was so inspired by this thought that he attempted at once to reform the religions of the land, to make all the peoples of his empire realize the one God, a mighty and a just God. And he ordered the destruction of the pagan gods, idols, and statues in the temples, and even ordered the immediate eradication from the walls of the great temples of prayers of adoration to the false gods. And these chisel marks, deep etchings into the stone wall before us, were made by those acting under his command to remove the tribute to the false gods. Nothing else did he destroy, all other art he preserved. We could not fail to admire the courage of a man who dared to change overnight, one might say, the religion of the people, to lift them boldly from their superstition and ignorance to a higher and loftier plane, who incurred the hatred of the priesthood by these acts and who brought about the ruination of his power. An entire day was spent at Luxor Temple, an insignificant period to appreciate properly its history or even to attempt a careful study of its architecture and its inscriptions, but sufficient time, with the ideal lighting Egypt affords for considerable photography. Leaving Luxor Temple, we turned again to look westward. Ever since our arrival, we seem to have been drawn to those purple hills, rugged cliffs across the Nile. Although they were foreboding in appearance, we always felt a strange fascination for them as the sun set behind their crowns. Tomorrow, we would succumb to this magnetic attraction and cross the Nile to them. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.